Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar, Helping Schools Deal with Tragedy. We're very glad you could join us today. My name is Jim Nolson, and I'm the Director of Business Development for Safe Schools. You may know us best for our staff training and tracking system. We also offer solutions for MSDS and chemical inventory management, bullying incident reporting and tracking, as well as accident tracking. But today we're so pleased to bring you Dr. Scott Poland this afternoon. In addition to being one of our Safe Schools training authors, Dr. Poland is a nationally recognized expert on school violence prevention and crisis response. He has been instrumental in guiding a number of schools through the aftermath of a shooting. Dr. Poland brings over 26 years of experience working in schools as a counselor and as the Director of Psychological Services for Cypress Fairbanks ISD in Houston. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping tips. You can ask questions throughout the webinar, and you can do so. Everyone's going to be on mute today. We have, I think, again, several hundred people that are going to be joining us, and the background noise would be insane. So go ahead. If you have any questions, you've got an area with the GoToWebinar control panel where you can type those questions in, and we're going to save those and get to as many as we can after the webinar is over. So we're going to hold those till the end. And as a courtesy, we'll also make Dr. Poland's PowerPoint presentation available, and we are recording the webinar today too, so we're going to make that available at a later date too. So with that, I'd like to now turn it over to Dr. Poland.
Thank you very much, Jim, and indeed it's my pleasure to have a chance to present today, and I hope to say things that will be helpful and meaningful to every single participant. And certainly the aftermath of school tragedy has been on the minds of everyone in the sad reality of what happened in Newtown, Connecticut. I'd like to begin, though, with something that is really important to say about school violence, and that is that schools still remain the safest places that young people go. And I'd like to start my presentation really talking about what is the most common tragedy that might take the life of a student, and that would, of course, be an accident. And I've just put up a slide imagining that you're the counselor or you're the psychologist and your high school principal is called. They are actually at the hospital, and one of the students has been killed in an accident, and large numbers of classmates have gathered at the hospital, and the principal is really calling for assistance and advice. And I do believe the wisest decisions in education are always made by a group of people. And I want everybody to be thinking about, especially if this was like the Friday beginning a 2-week holiday period, what does everybody think is reasonable to expect schools to do? And I actually received a call like this from a principal during the years I worked in the schools, and he indicated that the students that are at the hospital were really creating chaos, and they have basically been told that they need to leave the premises. And I asked, well, what are they saying and where are they going? And he said, well, it's already dark, but they're all talking about gathering at a park somewhere. And one of the most important things we can do is always surround young people that have experienced tragedy with adults and with caring adults. And so we basically came up with a couple of things quickly, and that is encouraging all the students to call their parents and let them know what's happened. We decided that we were going to open the high school, and I agreed that, of course, I would go there to help. We talked about ways that we could use the calling tree to activate and let key personnel that worked at the high school know what's happened. We also talked about how could we get some kind of communication network going to parents so they would be reaching out to their children. And we discovered that the young man who was killed, he was on one of our sports teams. His older brother was on a different sports team, and we had a very active booster club, and we had the ability to get some phone calls going through that. And one of the things that I believe strongly is there's no perfect response to a school tragedy. It's really all about working as a team, telling the truth and developmentally appropriate language to all of the students, and really focusing on we're here to help you. And we did get through that tragedy. In fact, I often believe that things go better than many times the adults think is at all possible. And it's just really about getting a caring community that involves the school and the parents and everybody being there to assist all those that are affected. And I think it's very important today that we just take a moment and emphasize prevention and the leading causes of death for young people in our country. And number one is an accident. And if they're secondary age, it's almost always a car accident. And there are a lot of programs to try to reduce those senseless deaths and make sure families know about graduated driving laws and to reduce young people that are texting and driving, and to use some of the technology that's available today to basically eliminate the ability to text and drive, and obviously to do something about young people driving under the influence of drugs and alcohol. And then if they're younger victims of an accident, it very likely was a drowning or a bicycle accident. There's obvious prevention points that everybody is thinking to reduce those as well. And the second leading cause of death for a young person in this country is a homicide, although we must recognize the chances of them being a homicide victim at a school in our country are about 1 in 2.5 million. And I certainly believe that one violent death on school grounds is unacceptable, but we also need to work on prevention in our homes, our communities, and neighborhoods. And then I've really spent 30 years advocating for suicide prevention in schools, and schools providing a leadership role in their communities to make sure everybody is aware of the warning signs of suicide, as it is the third leading cause of death for young people in our country. And we must all keep up with current trends and important issues that we need to be aware of for prevention. And I hope that every person listening today who works in a school, I hope they can say that their school has a crisis team, they have a prevention task force, and there's continual dialogue about school safety, prevention, and how do we improve our crisis response. And I've responded to a lot of tragedies. I've consulted with schools all around the nation, even all around the world. And what I believe is that every school has had some type of a crisis. And I never want to make anybody feel bad, but I always like to ask, what worked? What didn't work? What did you learn from that situation? What could we be doing to prevent something like that from ever happening again? And moving on, I've organized all of the books that I have written with regards to a model from Gerald Kaplan, Primary Prevention, which is what I began with. What are we doing to prevent the leading causes of death for young people in our country? And Secondary Intervention, which is what we do in the immediate aftermath. Sometimes the principal will say, decisions we made in the first couple of hours about how we were going to manage the crisis, it really set the tone for us. And certainly the immediate response that day and the day after is very important. But we also need to recognize the need for what Kaplan called the tertiary level. And here's a comment that I hear often from school crisis team members. We went there the day after the tragic lightning strike on the football field that killed the 2 students, and we feel good about things we did to try to assist school. However, we were never able to go back. And I'm really sorry to tell you that there's often an anniversary effect to suicide. And what do I mean by that? I mean that someone might die by suicide on the anniversary of the tragedy, the loss of their loved one or their best friend, or maybe even on the birthday that their best friend would have had. So tertiary intervention is always going to be focusing on what might we need to be doing 3 months later, 6 months later. What about the anniversary? And I'm not talking about making some kind of announcement over the loudspeaker about a year ago today our tragedy occurred. I'm just talking about knowing who is going to be the most affected and reaching out to them on that very difficult anniversary day. And when a death occurs, it's just absolutely essential that schools have correct information. There's a great quote from the literature that says something like this: the teacher must be seen as the dispenser of correct information. Well, that only occurs when the administration is verified and let teachers know what has actually happened. And we would always work on providing a script to teachers, as well as making sure that our best support personnel go to the key classes where we would expect the most emotional outpouring. And in today's world, we can't really hesitate in terms of trying to find out the facts, because if we say something like, oh, well, we'll have this all sorted out by tomorrow, meanwhile, half the kids in the school have got a text message about what has occurred. So getting with the police, getting with the families quickly, and then being able to verify, and certainly I would agree with double checking to make sure we have our facts correct. And then we need to let our faculty know what's happened. And it would be my hope that school faculty have already been trained about dealing with tragedy and the death of someone in the school community. And often there's some uncertainty about whether a death was suicide or not. Again, I've had many situations where the principal and I get in the car, drive to the family's home, reach out to them, meet the surviving sibling, talk with them about how important it is to basically be able to tell the truth in terms of being able to assist the classmates and to also work on future suicide prevention in our school and community. And actually there is a wonderful resource that came out a little over a year ago from the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and the Suicide Prevention Resource Center, something that I did have a role in developing. It's After a Suicide Toolkit for Schools, and it is going to answer the countless questions that schools often have after a suicide. So please be aware of that resource. It also includes sample letters and several different type letters depending on the circumstances with the family and their requests, and it really provides excellent guidance to schools after a very difficult situation. Earlier I talked about making decisions as a group, and those are the wisest ones that I've seen in my career. And the idea is that we want the administrator to always be empowering the crisis team members. And of course, team members need to know their roles. There need to be frequent meetings where people discuss their roles with both prevention and intervention after a tragedy. And I'm reminded of one situation where it was a staggering tragedy where the dad had basically sadly killed the entire family, and 3 little girls that attended an elementary school were killed. And I remember the meeting before school, and by the way, it is so important to help the faculty first. And the analogy I always like to use to make this point is, if you were traveling on an airplane with a small child, what was it that the flight attendant told you to do if there was an oxygen level problem in the cabin? And everyone listening knows that the oxygen mask goes over the adult's mouth first, because if mom or dad passes out, they would be of absolutely no assistance to their small child. Well, what's the point I'm trying to make with regards to school crisis? We've got to help our teachers first. Then they're going to be in a better position to help our students. We have to be able to help our parents through meetings and guidance so that they will be in a better position to help their children. So back to my example. It was a staggering tragedy, but I'll never forget the principal saying to the faculty in the meeting before school, this is probably going to be the worst day you've ever spent in education. And certainly I know it's not going to be a good day. But when I had a chance to speak, I basically emphasized that together we're going to help each other. We're going to help our students. And this day will go better than you ever thought that it could because of all the caring that we have in our school. So it's important the administrator be positive and empowering. And we're going to be looking at a couple of other key things, and perhaps a very significant one is, in my career, I have found that schools have a tendency to underestimate the impact of a tragedy, or they sometimes think, oh, it only affects this school, when in fact there's logical connections to the feeder school, or the mother of the victim works in another school, or somebody has transferred. And so we need to make sure that we're providing assistance to all of the schools that are affected. And in one of the places where I worked, they insisted that the announcement was made over the loudspeaker, something like this. I know everybody's saddened by the death of Bubba on his way to the high school this morning. However, your counselors have gone to the state capitol for training. If you'll just hold your emotions until Monday, they will be back and the counselors can help you. And we all know that it doesn't work that way. And that's why it's so important to have a plan and realize who can be the extra social workers, counselors, and psychologists that can help you at this difficult time. Calling trees are essential. We need to make sure that we can get in contact with everyone tonight. If we just became aware of the tragedy after school, for example. And why is the calling tree so important? It gives everybody a chance to deal with the shock of this tragic news. It gives them a chance to turn to their significant other, get the help that they need, and very importantly, we can let all staff know about the meeting we are going to have before school begins in the morning to go over our plan. And we need to have our crisis materials ready and accessible. In terms of my favorite is when these materials have been a part of teacher training. They're in the teacher handbook, and the teachers are going to bring their handbook to the meeting before school starts, and we're going to go over key points. And in my career in the large district in Texas, I'm very sorry to tell you there were countless tragedies, and I've already emphasized the importance of knowing the facts, having a plan, but one of the roles that I performed many times was to give essentially a pep talk to the faculty. And I've had to give pep talks to other support personnel around the country. In fact, one of my former interns called me the other day and very upset because a key staff member had been killed, and knowing that as the psychologist she would be expected to basically have a plan and to help other people. And essentially I spent time reminding her of the training that she had received, giving her a pep talk, assuring her that I knew she could do it, she could collaborate, work as a team member, and trying to improve her confidence level in that she actually had what it takes to be able to help people in the aftermath of a tragedy. And what I always like to say to teachers is the very things that made you want to be in education, because you care about children so much, those things are going to help you today. And working in the aftermath of Columbine, I remember telling the teachers, let your heart be your guide. In your heart, you have very good ideas about what children need. Let them know they're going to have a chance to talk about it, a chance to write about it, a chance to express emotions through artwork, projects, ceremonies, and rituals. And my experience has found that the younger the child is, the more that it's artwork, it's drawing, it's get out the poster board and the markers, and let's make something in memory of the deceased, and then we'll share what the students have made with their family. And the older students are, the more they want to talk about it. And a wonderful thing about young people is that they often want to make a difference in the world. I like to call it the gift of hope. And they will be gathering money to help the families, or trying to come up with supplies to help the victims of a natural disaster, for example. Or they want to start prevention programs such as Students Against Violence Everywhere, or Students Against Destructive Decisions, or the Yellow Ribbon Program, which is about suicide prevention. So helping the teachers and empowering them, that's very important as the first step. And then when we enter a classroom, and I am a big believer in the majority of the assistance that children need after a tragedy, it should be delivered in a classroom. You know, if we have a really popular student that's died, and we have a middle school of 1,200, and we have 10% of the students really upset, I mean, frankly, we just do not have room for 120 students to come to a counseling office. And I'm not a fan of telling all the students that are upset to go into the library or a large room, because pretty quickly they have shut the adults out. So I like to see trained and empowered staff members lead discussions in classrooms. But I would admit that I made a mistake for many years of my career in that, imagine the counselor and I are standing up in front of the classroom, We're talking about how important it is for you to process and share what's on your mind today and giving them permission for any and all these feelings. But the problem is often the physical arrangement of the classroom, because they are in rows they can't even see the people behind them. So the smartest thing that I could do is sit down in a chair with them after we have put all the desks in the circle. And I've spent a career really trying to stop the adults from doing what I would call talking at students. We want to be talking with them. And the less the adults say and the more the students talk, the better. And I've also learned if I don't have every fact correct, or if I somehow didn't know that the deceased went by a nickname, well, I've lost a lot of credibility immediately. And I'll usually begin with something like, I didn't know your friend Nikki. I've heard a lot of things about her. I would like to hear about her, and who could tell me where Nikki would have been seated in this classroom had she not died yesterday? Who could talk to me about the things they liked the most about Nikki? And then at some point I would be indicating, I've helped other young people before when tragic things have happened, and I hope that you will give me the opportunity to assist you. So providing opportunities where students really feel heard. One of my favorite phrases to share with adults is reach out, don't preach, and really be there to listen to young people. There are some key questions that help all of us determine how big of an outpouring of emotionality there might be. The very first question, and I think all of these questions are very logical, who was the person? How long had she been a member of your school community? Gee, Scott, she died the second day of school. She just moved to Houston from Odessa, Texas. Hardly a ripple here in Houston. Well, the bulk of the intervention should be back in her home school in Odessa. So the popularity of the person, how long they've been a member of your school community. Their mom is the counselor secretary, and they've got brothers and sisters right there in your school. Second question is what happened to them. And I think everybody listening has probably lost someone to cancer, for example. And hopefully you had weeks and months to slowly get used to the idea that you might lose your loved ones to cancer. Well, I've had the experience where the teacher died of cancer yesterday, and you go in to help students, and they basically feel like somebody lied to them. Somebody was just there saying that their beloved teacher was getting better, and now you're there telling them that no, in fact, they have died. And we always want to think positively and keep everybody in our hopes and prayers, but we also need to let students know that not everybody diagnosed with cancer is going to recover. But the main point is when somebody has an illness like that, we have some time to be adjusting to the possible loss. When it's an accident, a homicide, or a suicide, it is sudden, violent, unexpected, therefore much more difficult to deal with. And where did the death occur? When it occurs at school, we can turn up the trauma meter many times, and I'll be talking a little bit more about that in a moment with circles of vulnerability. And when I get a call about what to do in response to a tragedy, and I get a number of those, after I hear about what happened yesterday, I'm always going to ask, what else? What was still on the minds of everybody before this tragedy happened? Were there unresolved issues from other tragic events in the community? And of course, one of the most difficult things for us is who was the perpetrator. When they were a known member of our school community, it's especially challenging to know what to do. And we actually went through about 2 decades where the majority of school shootings in this country were committed by student perpetrators. Now, we just had a very tragic situation in Connecticut where that young man was not a student at that particular school. But it's especially complicated when it is students that are really creating violence and terror in their own school. The administrator's role in a crisis, these are really pretty straightforward, and I've mentioned a number of them, but we obviously want them to get input from crisis team members, to keep the central administration informed. We already talked about the calling tree, and of course, what do I recommend if a tragedy occurs like right now and school is in session? Well, I would hope that there would be a way to communicate to all the staff members. One wise principal makes an announcement over the PA system to teachers saying, please check your email as quickly as possible. There would be the facts, there would be the script that was developed to give teachers directions in terms of what to say and what to do. I have seen the PA system used in an effective manner. That works the best when the administrator actually rehearses and practices what it is they're going to say. So they pay attention to their voice tone, their choice of words, and their inflection. And we've talked about telling the truth, but it's also important for the administrator to be visible and available when a tragedy has occurred. This is not a day to be away at a meeting or a training. And one of the sad realities, and I've responded now to 13 different school shootings, is that in almost all of those, we've had an increase in suicides for community members, parents, and students in the aftermath of those tragedies. And I really recommend strongly that suicide prevention training be included in communities that have sadly experienced a school shooting. And I said earlier, we must all know the real statistics about school violence, that schools do remain the safest places that young people go. And as we are in a tremendous debate in this country about what to do and what to change, I hope we will always remember and emphasize schools remain the safest places young people go. I think a very appropriate role for an administrator and a support person should help them with this is go contact the family of the deceased and express condolences. And almost always there are surviving siblings, and we need to reach out to them and help prepare them for their return to school. And the short and long-term impact is something we also need to keep in mind. And in responding to a tragic school shooting in Brazil, I met a wonderful principal by the name of Luis, and really quickly, Luis said things that were indicative of he'd had a lot of training in this area, but he said things like, we're not going to glamorize the perpetrator. We're going to put all of the attention on the survivors and the families and the victims. That's who we are going to focus on. We know that will be a long time, if ever, until we have the answers as to why this tragic school shooting occurred. We will not be turning away any sources of assistance. In fact, he described how 3 shifts of psychologists would be at the school for an indefinite period of time, a morning, afternoon, and an evening shift, and the plans that were in place to help the students over the summer. And many of the students affected were 8th graders, and what was going to be in place to help them in their new high school the ensuing fall. And you know, his responses and that recognizing that they were in it for the long haul was just extraordinary. He also used the term that, oh, we're going to be doing mapping, and the mapping is very much like the circles of vulnerability that I'm going to show you in a few moments. And of course, I believe strongly that we need to protect our staff and students from media interviews. Schools really do need to provide updates and interviews, but we can move those away from the affected school. We can have trained spokespersons that are going to clarify all the things that the school is doing, and we can use the media to basically let everybody know sources of support and our plans. I also like to see schools reopened as quickly as possible, and would argue that school staff members are the greatest sources of assistance that many children have, and that when we close school, very few families can have parents that can stay home from work. And we also need to have some kind of an open house or a parent meeting where we educate parents about what to expect, how to help their children, and really answer any and all questions they might have about school safety. And the administrator basically needs to concentrate on what it is they need to provide leadership in the aftermath of the crisis. And Hawaii superintendent once said, the tragedy becomes the curriculum, and we'll take the cue from our students when we get back to our regular and planned curriculum. And of course, everybody needs to be given permission for a range of religious beliefs. And a very effective school response was going to the hospital with the family, reuniting the siblings with parents, and going back to the school late in the evening and making plans with support staff and other administrators for the next morning, having the faculty meeting before school, taking the sixth grade hallway and putting up block paper and making sure that students had a chance to write their goodbye messages to their classmate that was killed, and monitoring and providing ongoing assistance for a considerable period of time to the affected middle school, as well as the younger sibling who survived, and at the elementary, and the older one at the high school. Support personnel, I always like to think that they need to be the right-hand person of the administrator, and they help the faculty first. They recognize the individual crisis history that every single person has, and that the support personnel always have a very positive view about how they are going to be able to help people in the aftermath of tragedy, and having key support personnel follow the schedule of the deceased and remember to be talking with students, not at them. I've already talked about the importance of the majority of students getting the help they need in the classroom. It's also very important to be communicating with parents, and not in some kind of a role where, as a psychologist, gee, Mrs. Smith, I hope it was okay that I saw your child today, because normally I would have gotten written permission. No, and my approach would simply be, Mrs. Smith, you must have heard what's happened. I am the psychologist. I'm here helping today. I met your daughter. I'd like to talk with you about how we can all work together to help her in the aftermath of this tragedy. And the Y school would locate additional sources of resources today. Who are they going to call on? Are they going to bring in counselors within the district that students might know? Is there a community agency? Are there private practitioners and clergy that are very helpful and have worked effectively with them before? Figure it out today, and then certainly to advocate for ongoing services for the approximately 20% that are going to have some long-term issues. Teachers' role, again, we talked about them telling the truth, about the importance of modeling expression of emotions, knowing the students well and their crisis history, being alert for students that don't bounce back and demonstrate some resiliency, and students that might be experiencing PTSD symptoms. And the teacher, of course, is the key person to know the facts and stop the rumors, and to put in place activities that will help young people. And in our schools today, we also need to prepare young people for funerals. And I'm a big believer that the funerals need to be after school or in the evening, and parents need to be encouraged to go to funerals with their children. And often at funerals, it's the school staff members helping grieving students and wondering where in the world are their parents. But educating them about visitation and funeral expectations, and you have a choice about whether to view the body if the casket is open, and basically supporting them through this difficult process. Now I've turned to there are actually 3 circles of vulnerability. And I believe this model, which I did learn from psychologists in Israel, is applicable to almost any tragedy, whether it was a car accident, whether it was a staff member who died of a heart attack in the hallway, whether it was the tragic suicide of a young person at their home, or whether somebody in the community was a victim of violence in a shooting, for example. We're going to begin with trying to figure out in our school community who was directly exposed, who was right there in the classroom, or who was the first car to come upon the accident. And then you're going to have other people that they weren't in the classroom. Maybe they were down the hall, or they were in the building next door. Or you may have somebody who was actually home the day that the popular coach died by a heart attack in the gym. So we began by looking at the geographic location. And if you would think of these as like a psychological triage, certainly the medical community has an entire numbering system for a mass casualty situation. So this is applying a little bit of science and logistics to the aftermath of a tragedy with regards to emotionality. The second circle is called population at risk. And earlier I said everybody has their own unique trauma history. Well, someone in your school community may have experienced a very similar trauma. Maybe they have a friend who's killed in a car accident, and you find out their older brother 3 years ago was killed in a car accident. So looking at the individual trauma history and situations going on in their own life. Someone might have a grandmother who's much beloved who is dying of cancer right now. So they're undergoing a lot of difficulty themselves. And our third one would really be the close identification to the victim. And the most significant would be if you lose somebody in your immediate family. And after that, it would be the person who died was like your best friend, or then they were someone you knew but not best friends. And the one thing I hope everybody listening today will take away from this is let's look at the intersection of our three circles of vulnerability. And who would we triage as being at greatest risk? The person who was right there in the car and survived the accident that killed their best friend. And the survivor of the accident, their mom actually sadly died of cancer 2 weeks ago. So I have found this very helpful, although being honest, sometimes schools are resistant to think this way. If you think this way, then you're going to have to realize our crisis intervention isn't over in just a couple of days. Instead, we're going to have to recognize long-term follow-up for at least a percentage of our school community. Earlier, I already pretty well covered this slide about the funeral, so you do have several of the points in writing that I talked about. Here are the typical reactions that children have to a tragedy. And I've really found these virtually every time in my career. So don't think of these as abnormal reactions. Think of them as normal reactions. They fear the future. They think it could happen again. They have worries. They have nightmares, sleeping problems. They regress academically and behaviorally. Here's an example for you. Let's call him Tom. Tom was 14. He found his 15-year-old sister hanging dead in her closet. Let's pick it up the next morning. Counselor and I are meeting with Tom and his parents, and they're basically saying, he asked us for a nightlight last night. We told him absolutely not. You're 14, you don't need a nightlight. Mom and Dad, let him have a nightlight. Regression behaviorally is to be expected. I guarantee you it will not be on a year from now. Now let's pick it up 5 weeks later. All of Tom's teachers are sitting around the conference table. One at a time, they basically say, he's so smart, but he's failed my class. He's failed every class. The teachers are basically closing their grade book. They're going to go. And I'm the one person saying, wait a minute. Don't you remember what happened 5 weeks ago? Can't we do something besides fail him in every class? And what we want all adults to have in the way of response to young people that have been affected by a tragedy is respond with patience, structure, routine, tolerance, and love. Earlier I mentioned that schools are really the logical place to detect which young people are not doing very well in the aftermath of a tragedy. And we have to advocate for long-term services both in our school and in our community. But if we have young people that won't go in that entrance because that's where the tragedy occurred, if they essentially feel numb, if they jump every time there is a loud noise, and they're agitated and they're having sleeping problems and irritability really weeks and months after the tragedy. And by the way, one of the key diagnostic principles about PTSD as someone who basically had an intense fear and was in a situation where they felt helpless and hopeless and really felt that they could have, in fact, been killed in the situation. Resiliency, I could argue it's the biggest word in all of psychology today. And why is it that some people bounce back and some people don't do so well? And everybody listening may, in fact, know somebody who it was after a tragedy that their life never seemed to be the same. Maybe they never reinvested in relationships. Maybe they turned to drugs and substance abuse. Maybe, sadly, they even ended their own life. But what is it that makes one person able to bounce back? And very quickly, the literature says, when we're surrounded by loving and caring family and friends, we do better. When we have a positive view of ourselves and our ability to solve problems, and we remain optimistic about the future, and when we are comfortable venting and sharing strong emotions, we simply do a lot better. And I'd like to spend just a few minutes, and I know there's going to be some questions in a moment, and we had a staggering tragedy in our country. And having been a responder to many school shootings and trying to keep up with the literature, there are just a couple of points that I would like to highlight here. And one of them is a concern that one of the programs recommends. The C stands for countermeasure or charge the gunman. And I am not sure that is really the best approach. I'm also concerned that in our country recently, some schools have conducted some extremely realistic crisis drills on days that schools actually had students present. And I'm talking about SWAT teams and real gunfire. And I think I'd like to just say we need to be prepared, but not scared. And certainly practicing evacuation, practicing lockdown, practicing making sure that all students know to look to the nearest adult and do absolutely what the adult tells them to do. That is very important. But we need to be careful not to scare students. And again, emphasize schools are the safest places that anyone goes. A couple of the other points up there, and we often have had a pattern of where there were countless warning signs that were somehow missed. Often this has involved postings and computers and weapons at homes, and I'm a big believer that parents need to be involved in their children's lives. And I also think parents know when they have a disturbed child, and we need to make sure that mental health services are available and that we somehow overcome the stigma that many people feel about getting mental health services. And we need to take a look at the media violence and our fascinations with guns, violence, bombs, and the ever-increasing level of violence in our video games. And all schools need a threat assessment team. This is a recommendation that's been around for at least 15 years now. And who should be on that threat assessment team? And there's excellent resources available from the U.S. Department of Education. That team should have an administrator, of course, a teacher in question who knows the student that is suspected of making threats. So we've got to have teachers that know the young people we suspect of making threats and being violent. We need a mental health professional, and we need law enforcement. And that group of people needs to huddle up, ask each other questions, figure out what are the logical steps here, what information do we not have. And of course, I'm a very big believer in making sure that everyone in school is alert, making sure that we keep doors locked except for the front door, we meet and greet visitors, and we make certain that our students don't open doors to let anybody in the side or the back of the building. So other key point is that when school personnel tell a parent that there's a problem, we very much hope that the parents are going to respond not by being defensive, They're going to be supportive of the school personnel and their experience and follow through with getting support services. Safety pledges, those were used in the district where I worked, where all the students signed a pledge that basically said something like, I will let an adult determine the seriousness of a violent threat. I will report the presence of a weapon on campus to the nearest adult immediately. And there are also anti-bullying pledges that can also be very, very helpful. We all need to advocate for mental health services at school and in the community. And I'm an especially big believer in what I like to call the fourth R. The fourth R is relationships. So it's not just reading, writing, arithmetic, relationships. We need to make sure that every student feels a connection to their school and with staff members and students in the school. And the bottom line is the school should be a place that young people like to go, not a place that they would ever think about blowing up or committing some kind of an act of violence. So that positive culture at school and that school connection is very important as we all work to make our schools safer. And I'm a big believer that school safety is most of all an inside job. We got to get commitment from the student body first, then from the faculty, parents, and the community. And I'd like to turn it back to Jim to see what questions our audience might have for me today.
Thank you, Dr. Poland. Really appreciate that. And we do have a few questions that have come in, and we'll just start here at the top of the list. We did have a question regarding if a student dies, should you have a funeral of the student at the school? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, Jim, this depends a lot on the size of the community and the resources. And, you know, I would advocate that, first of all, the funeral should be after school hours so that everybody feels like there's a choice rather than having it be basically third period on Thursday morning. I hope that in most communities, the funeral could be at a local church, or it could be, you know, at a mortuary. And of course, I gave a presentation for private schools recently, and the chaplains were all like, well, we essentially, the church is a part of the school. You know, we have the sanctuary right at the school. So my answer for schools that are associated with churches was, yes, the funeral is going to be there. But for the typical public school, I would hope that the funeral would be out in the community and not at school.
Great. We've had a few of our attendees ask for a little further explanation on the 60-20-20 concept. Can you elaborate on that just a little bit?
Absolutely. That really goes with the circles of vulnerability. And here's the bottom line. No matter how staggering the tragedy, our best estimate would be 60% of those affected, they're actually going to be okay. They're going to turn to their family, their faith, their coping mechanisms, their optimism, their, you know, staying busy and getting exercise and sleeping and eating, you know, properly, and they're going to be okay. 20% would have what we would call minor problems. Minor problems are not going to persist for a long time. They're not going to be debilitating. But we would also predict that 20% would have major problems. And really, when I was talking about the intersection of our three circles, that's where we would predict our 20% to be. And those are the ones we really need to monitor closely and try to make sure that they get ongoing mental health assistance.
Great. Another question here. From your experience, will an SRO or an armed volunteer be an effective deterrent?
All right, great question. And I am a very big fan of school police and SROs. My personal opinion is that I am not a fan of the idea that we would ever arm anyone at school besides a trained police officer. And I do believe that SROs are a deterrent. I also think that SRO effectiveness is really the best when they are good at building relationships with young people, when they're outgoing and they're speakers in classes and they're visible and available, which is a big part of SROs. They recognize the preventative aspect of their particular job. And there was a great article written by a teacher that she said something like this: I want to be armed. I want to be armed with the school psychologist that provides mental health services. I want to be armed with smaller classes so I can get to know every student well. I want to be armed with the counselor that doesn't spend all their time juggling schedules and doing clerical and testing duties. That's what I want to be armed with. And I think that pretty well summarizes my particular points. I'd like a balanced approach, and I certainly know that there are schools in this country that need an armed police officer. But I think there are schools in this country that could better spend their money on mental health services. And I hope schools will have the ability to make choices that they believe are best for their local community.
Great. We do have several more questions coming in here. One is, what else can be done if there's a concern with a student or students that have had a defined plan to use guns and bombs within a school, besides letting state troopers know and letting teams at the school know and making sure that the secretaries know not to let those students into the building? Is there anything else that you can recommend that might be done in a situation like this?
All right. Well, I always like to hope that schools have options in terms of, just having a troubled and potentially violent student sitting out of school. I'm not sure what changes about their behavior, so I'm always going to wonder, where's the counseling, where's the mental health intervention, where's our next level of a very secure school setting where they can really be intensely supervised and get the services that they need. I'm always going to try to get a supportive reaction from their parents so that they will work with us to do things like monitor their children more closely, remove access to lethal weapons. And I think it's really going to take a village in the entire community to have the kind of resources and interventions I just described. And we want the parents to basically be on our side, all of us working together to get the potentially violent young person the help they need.
Great. A few more questions before we get to the next couple of questions. We do have several questions asking if the PowerPoint will be available, and just want to let you know that we will be emailing the PowerPoint from today's webinar to everybody so that you have a copy that you can review. So, but moving on to some of the other questions coming in, what about memorial or monuments that are placed on campus for remembrance? Is that, what are your thoughts about doing that?
Well, in general, I discourage memorials and monuments. I like what I would call memorials that focus on the living. And when you focus on the living, then it's more about services. It's more about a scholarship in their memory. It's more about starting a prevention program as opposed to something that you walk by and see every single day. And perhaps the most complicated question for a school is, should we have a memorial to a young person who died by suicide? Now, that toolkit for schools that I had a part in, we basically took the stance, let's strive to treat all the deaths the same. And if you have a memorial for the kid who was at school, for the kid who was killed crossing the crosswalk, then you would also have a memorial for the young person who died by suicide. But in general, we're still trying not to dramatize, not to glamorize, and the more that we can have either no permanent markers at school or something very small, like one of the schools I visited, they were very concerned that they had a little plaque in a tree for a suicide victim. But I said, well, show me where it is. And it was like 300 yards behind the school on the far side of the soccer practice field. Well, that's a lot different than walking by something big that's right by the front door. So I know schools wrestle with this issue, and generally, let's focus on doing something that helps the living.
Great. And we've had a couple questions on this, and I know that this is probably going to be this can be a polarizing topic, but one is a lot of the recent advice on the matter of charging a gunman is now advocated by some. How do you reconcile this with the opinion that you offered in your discussion earlier?
Well, great. I am aware, and it's the ALICE program. The A stands for alert. Certainly I support that. L stands for lockdown. I stands for inform. And if we see someone with a gun, what was their description? What direction were they heading? What did the gun look like? All of that, very important. The E stands for evacuate, which I very much support. But I have reservations about the counter. First of all, I think if we rehearse that, we are basically scaring children unnecessarily. Remember I said prepared but not scared. And I also think that the charging technique would make more sense with the adults. It would make more sense with high school students. I'm not sure it makes much sense with elementary school students. And I will defer to and think, we need to look at what did the majority of security specialists and police agencies, what are they telling us about this particular program? And I do know that a few of them have supported it, but I have some concerns, and I hope that schools will look very carefully at that program and also maximize and follow some of the other recommendations that I've made as a part of this program.
Great. I know we have time for a few more questions here. I know we're coming up on 3 o'clock. If we don't get to your questions, just know that we'll be emailing answers back and following up with those. But just a couple more here. Is remodeling schools to have a lobby containment area a cost-effective preventative?
Well, I think a problem that we have is that a lot of schools weren't necessarily built with some of our current concerns in mind. And one of the problems is when you have a front door, but really there's no desk or there's no assistant or secretary with a direct line to the front door. So some schools have actually done so far is to pull a desk out of the office and put it right there by the front door. I do think some looking at what are some cost-effective ways that we can make certain that we meet and greet every visitor, they sign in properly, and many schools have the ability to do a quick background check. Do they have a good reason for being here? Are they possibly under the influence of anything? What is their mood state? So I would definitely support at least some modest proposals to try to change the entry to the main office at a school so that every visitor is going to be interacted with.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Pullen. It is 3 o'clock now, so unfortunately that'll be the end of the question and answer session. For those of you who have typed in questions, thank you. Those are recorded, and we'll be able to we'll try to get those to Dr. Pullen and get you an answer through email and possibly follow up with those questions as we send a copy of the PowerPoint to all attendees as a courtesy. So you'll all be getting this PowerPoint emailed to you very shortly. And again, thanks so much to Dr. Pullen. Thanks so much for everyone who joined us today. If you need to contact any of us, you've seen our contact information here on the screen. Dr. Scott Pullen, you've got his email address right there, and then www.scottpullen.com. You can also contact us at Safe Schools online staff training system. You can learn more about us at www.safeschools.com. And we've been getting some really nice feedback about this webinar. We did one with Dr. Pullen just a few weeks ago. And stay tuned for next month. We plan on having a webinar series that will hopefully offer some really great information to everyone here that cares enough to come on and learn more about these really important things. So thanks again, Dr. Pullen. Thanks again to everybody. And you'll be getting an email from us shortly with the PowerPoint presentation. Have a great night. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you, Jim. Bye.